The diplomatic beacon came back in pieces. Not metaphorically, not as a signal degraded by distance or interference. The beacon returned to Earth's monitoring station at Lagrange Point 3 as a physical object, a fist-sized sphere of fractured titanium alloy, its interior transmission matrix shattered by focused directed energy, its outer casing scored with the precise hexagonal burn pattern that was the exclusive signature of Galactic Council Arbiter-class weapons platforms. Someone had not merely silenced the beacon. Someone had destroyed it deliberately up close and sent the fragments home. Ambassador Yusra Akafer had been carrying it when she boarded the Conclave shuttle at Proxima Station 17 days ago. Admiral Constance Reyes Marchetti read the recovery report 3 times. She was sitting at the head of the Joint Command table in Lunar Operations Center, and the room was very quiet, and she read it 3 times because the first 2 times she thought she must be misreading it, that her 41 years of service had not actually led her to this moment, this particular and catastrophic morning. The 3rd time through, she set the report down on the polished table and looked at the 11 other people in the room and said, "Tell me what we know." What they knew was this. Ambassador Akafer had departed Proxima Station aboard the GCS Deliberation, a Galactic Council vessel, neutral under the Accords bound for the Conclave at Kepler Station, where humanity's petition for associate member status was scheduled to be heard for the 5th time in 12 years. She had with her a staff of 9, 3 diplomatic aides, 2 xenolinguists, a pair of cultural attachés, and 2 personal security officers named Specialist Tors and Specialist Cho. The deliberation had arrived at Kepler Station on schedule. The conclave session had convened. And then, on the 3rd day of deliberations, the GCS deliberation had departed the station on a scheduled supply run to the fuel depot at the outer marker, and had never returned. What had returned, 11 days later, packed in a council diplomatic pouch addressed to Earth's unified government, was the beacon, and a single document printed on actual paper in the formal script of Galactic Council High Notation, which the xenolinguists translated in 37 minutes. It said, "Humanity's petition is declined. The matter is closed. Further petitions will not be considered." This communication represents the Council's final position on the matter of species designation for the organisms of the 3rd planet of the Sol system. No mention of the deliberation. No mention of Ambassador Akafer or her staff. No acknowledgement of the beacon's condition or how it had come to be returned in the state it was in. Just the decision, and the paper it was printed on, and the assumption, so naked it was almost admirable, that humanity would accept this and say nothing more. 12 years of petitions, 12 years of diplomatic missions, language courses, cultural exchange programs. 12 years of Earth's best minds learning the Council's protocols with the diligence of scholars preparing for an examination that kept getting harder and then harder again, and always for the same reasons. Insufficient interstellar presence, insufficient demonstrated capacity for large-scale resource extraction, insufficient proof of ideological compatibility with the Council's governance framework. 12 years of humanity being told it was not quite good enough yet. Keep trying. Here are our requirements. Meet these and we'll reconsider. The beacon was in pieces on her table. Reyes Marchetti looked at Vice Admiral Okoro, who commanded Earth's 3rd Fleet, currently stationed at the Jupiter Exclusion Zone. She looked at General Huang, who commanded the Martian Defense Corps. She looked at Director Sale of Unified Intelligence, who was the calmest person in the room by a significant margin, which Reyes Marchetti had always found either admirable or deeply unsettling depending on the day. She said, "I want every ship we have recalled to the inner system within 72 hours. I want the Jupiter Exclusion Zone patrols doubled. I want the deep listening arrays at Proxima and Barnard Star running full-spectrum surveillance as of right now. And I want the Diplomatic Corps to transmit a formal inquiry to the Council demanding a full accounting of the deliberation and its passengers. General Huang said carefully, "And if the council doesn't respond?" Reyes Marchetti said, "Then we'll know something important about what kind of problem we actually have." She didn't say what she was already thinking, which was, "I already know." The diplomatic corps transmitted the inquiry within the hour. The council's response arrived in 6 minutes, which was physically faster than it should have been possible given the signal lag, and which meant the response had been prepared and queued before the inquiry was even sent. The response said, "The matter of Ambassador Okafor and her delegation is an internal council matter not subject to external review. Humanity's inquiry is noted and declined." Reyes Marchetti called the full Joint Command to session and laid everything on the table. She did not give a speech. She did not invoke history or precedent or the memory of the 12 years of failed petitions. She simply presented the facts in order: the beacon, the document, the 6-minute response, the pre-prepared phrasing that demonstrated with mathematical certainty that the council had known what it was doing and had planned for humanity's reaction before it had even done the thing. Then she said, "We are not going to send another inquiry. We are not going to file a protest with the Accord arbitration body, because the Accord arbitration body is staffed exclusively by council member species, and the council has just demonstrated that they do not consider us to be a species that merits protection under those accords. We are going to do exactly one thing." She paused. "We are going to give them 24 hours to return our people." Vice Admiral Akaro leaned forward. He was a big man, silver-haired, with the specific stillness of someone who had been in combat and had learned that stillness was its own kind of readiness. He said, "And if they don't?" Reyes Marchetti said, "Then we give them something to study." There was silence around the table. Then, one by one, every person in that room nodded, not with excitement, not with the bright, fierce energy of people who wanted a war, with the quiet and deliberate weight of people who had decided that there was a line, and the line had been crossed, and there was nothing left to discuss about where it was. The 24-hour clock started at 800 hours, Sol Standard. In the 12 years of petitions, there had been a running argument inside Unified Command about what the word preparation actually meant. The diplomatic wing had argued that preparation meant learning. Language, protocol, cultural frameworks, the specific etiquette of council deliberation sessions, where the order of speakers was determined by a hierarchical structure that had evolved over 600 years and into which humanity had to insert itself without violating 17 different precedent arrangements. The Xenolinguistics Division had argued that preparation meant depth, not just learning the council's official languages but learning the registers, the implications, the things that existed in the grammar and could not be directly translated, the places where a high notation phrase carried a meaning that its surface reading did not reveal. They had spent 11 of those 12 years learning things that the council did not know they were learning, including 3 languages that humanity was technically not supposed to have access to, which the xenolinguists had reconstructed from fragments found in publicly available council archival material, by a process of inference that the council would later describe, in its internal reports, as improbably sophisticated for a pre-member species. The military wing had argued, more quietly and in rooms with fewer observers, that preparation also meant knowing where the edges were, where the arbiter-class platforms were positioned, what their sensor ranges were, how their targeting algorithms processed different categories of contact, which orbital mechanics around which bodies in the Sol system created approach vectors that the platform's coverage patterns left partially blind, how long it took a council enforcement response to spool up from observation posture to full engagement, whether there was a gap, however small, between the moment a council system detected a threat and the moment it was capable of acting on that detection. These were not preparations for aggression. They were preparations for survival, which was a different thing, and the distinction mattered in ways that went beyond the technical. A species preparing for aggression optimizes for first strike capability and concealment of intent. A species preparing for survival optimizes for resilience, for the ability to absorb a blow and function, to find the angles that an adversary's model has not accounted for, to turn the features of any environment into resources that the adversary does not recognize as resources, because the adversary has not spent time in that environment understanding it from the inside. Earth had spent 20 years studying Jupiter. The research program had been filed under atmospheric science and xenobiology, and it was those things genuinely. The papers were real, the data was valid, the findings about Jovian megafauna constituted a legitimate scientific contribution that had been published and peer-reviewed and cited widely. But the people doing that research had also, quietly and systematically, been accumulating a different kind of knowledge, operational knowledge. The knowledge of how to move through the Jovian cloud layers without being seen, how to use the pressure bands and the electromagnetic interference of the magnetosphere to mask heat signatures, which cloud strata provided the best cover against sensor sweep from orbital positions, how the airwells moved, and how their movement affected the local sensor environment, and what a ship looked like on a standard targeting array when it was traveling in the wake shadow of a 3-kilometer biological object. This knowledge had been filed in a different archive, under a different classification, and it had been updated every time a research mission returned with new data, and it had never once appeared in any document that the Council's observer drones had transmitted back to Kepler Station. The observers had been watching for 12 years. They had seen the petitions, the cultural exchanges, the careful, diligent learning. They had not seen the other archive. That was the preparation. By 900, the Galactic Council's observers, 3 of them, small automated drones that had orbited Earth since the first petition was filed 12 years ago, watching, filing reports, utterly unaware that anyone on Earth knew about them, detected a significant increase in electromagnetic emissions from both Lunar Operations Center and the Martian Defense Command. By 1100, the observers noted the activation of Earth's secondary shipyard at the L4 point, which had been in cold storage for 6 years. By 1400, the observers filed a report noting the departure of 17 vessels from the Jupiter exclusion zone on headings that suggested a general consolidation of force toward the inner system. The Council reviewed the observer reports at their Kepler Station conclave and reached a consensus that humanity was engaging in what the Council's diplomatic database categorized as a posturing response, a common behavior among pre-member species that had been declined status, characterized by a period of aggressive symbolic action followed by quiet acceptance of the new status quo. The Council had seen it dozens of times. The species would make noise, move assets around, maybe fire some weapons into empty space. Then they would calm down. Then, in a few years, they would submit another petition. That was how the cycle worked. That was how it had always worked. They did not respond to the ultimatum. At 8:01 on day 2, Admiral Reyes Marchetti transmitted a second and final message to the Galactic Council. It was considerably shorter than the first. It said, in high notation, "You had your time. Now we are coming." She transmitted it in every Council language simultaneously, including 3 that humanity technically was not supposed to know. The xenolinguists had spent those 12 years doing more than learning protocols. Then she picked up the handset on her command console, and she gave the order. The thing about humanity that the Council had spent 12 years studying and had fundamentally failed to understand was this: humans did not posture. They had learned posturing, the way a biologist learns the calls of a foreign bird species, academically, with careful attention to the mechanics and the function, and with no personal stake in the performance whatsoever. What the Council had observed in the 17 hours after the ultimatum began was not posturing. It was preparation. And the difference between those two things was the difference between an animal baring its teeth and an animal that had already decided where to bite. Vice Admiral Okoro's Third Fleet came out of the Jupiter exclusion zone at military acceleration and did not slow down. 17 ships, ranging from the heavy cruiser UES Kerensky down to a quartet of fast strike corvettes that the crews called the Knives. Not officially, the ships had designation numbers, but they were very fast and very sharp, and the name had stuck. The fleet had been drilling the Jupiter approach run for 4 years, not because anyone had seriously expected to need it, but because Vice Admiral Okoro was the kind of officer who believed you drilled the runs you hoped you'd never need precisely because you hoped you'd never need them. Okoro stood on the bridge of the Kerensky and watched the tactical display and felt, in the back of his mind, the particular cold clarity that comes to soldiers when a long preparation finally meets its purpose. He had been to Jupiter 12 times in 6 years. He knew every shadow in the exclusion zone, every resonance in the magnetosphere, every quirk of the long amber clouds that wrapped the gas giant's upper atmosphere. He knew, in the particular and intimate way that humans know places they have spent years inside, the Jovian Deep, where the pressure climbed from uncomfortable to lethal in a few dozen kilometers, and where creatures the size of cities drifted through the ammonia clouds like living continents. The airwells. Nobody in the Council had studied them seriously. The Council had catalogued them, assigned them a taxonomy number, noted their biological features, classified them as non-sapient megafauna, and moved on. They were not useful for resource extraction. They were not capable of communication. They did not generate the kind of strategic interest that warranted investment. Earth's research stations had been studying them for 20 years. The creatures were extraordinary in ways that a purely extractive assessment framework would never measure. They were 3 kilometers long on average, some significantly larger, filtering the Jovian atmosphere through organs that no Earth biology had developed analogs for, converting the ammonia-hydrogen soup of Jupiter's upper cloud layers into biological energy, with an efficiency that defied what the research team's initial models had predicted possible. They moved with a slowness that was not the slowness of something sluggish, but the slowness of something enormous, the way a continent moves, the way a tide moves, with an inevitability that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with mass. They were largely indifferent to the small machines that orbited and probed and occasionally attached monitoring equipment to their flanks. They did not perceive ships as predators. They did not perceive ships as anything in particular. The ships were smaller than the kite creatures that preyed on the young of the whales, those long dragon shapes that rode the thermal columns in the mid-stratosphere and struck with a speed that the whale's bulk made difficult to evade, and so the whales did not have an evolved response to them. What they did have was an evolved response to the destructor probes, not because the probes were a natural predator. Nothing in Jovian evolution had produced anything like a Council weapons platform, but because the probe's targeting emissions produced a specific electromagnetic frequency that the whale's sensory apparatus registered as a threat signature, for reasons the research teams had never fully explained but had documented extensively. When a probe entered a whale's sensory radius, the whale moved. Not fast, not dramatically, but it moved, and the way it moved was away from the emission source, and the mass of the creature moving created pressure waves in the cloud layers that disrupted sensor resolution for several kilometers in every direction. The research teams had filed this finding in the operational archive 4 years ago with the note, "Potential tactical application, threat-driven biological movement as sensor disruption." Nobody had ever expected to use it. Okoro thought about that. He thought about it carefully, standing at the tactical display, while his fleet moved on the bearing Yablonsky had calculated, and the Jovian clouds expanded on the forward screens from a distant amber smear to a thing of specific and enormous texture. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Petr Yablonsky, had built the approach plan around a single insight. If the Council's probes targeted non-sapient objects automatically, and the probes could not distinguish between a non-sapient machine and a non-sapient biological entity of sufficient size, and if the Council had never particularly studied the Jovian megafauna and therefore had not programmed their systems to recognize airwhales as a class of object distinct from potential threats, then you could use the whales, not to fight, not as weapons, as cover, as confusion. As the oldest trick in the hunter's handbook, become something the predator doesn't recognize. The fleet carried 46 of the magnetic anchor assemblies that Earth's researchers had developed for attaching monitoring equipment to the great drifting bodies of the airwhales without harming them. Repurposed, they could attach a small vessel to the exterior of a whale with sufficient force to ride out combat maneuvers. Coated with the biological signature dampers that the research teams used when they needed to work close to the creatures without triggering territorial behavior, a ship the size of one of the knives would read, on any standard sensor array, as a minor mass anomaly on an already enormous biological object. Yablonsky had called it the Nantucket Ride in her planning documents. It was an old Earth term for when a harpooned whale turned and ran and dragged the boat behind it. The whalers of old held on and rode the chaos and waited for their moment. The name had stuck. She had presented the plan to Akoro 6 months ago, in the quiet after the 5th rejected petition, with the specific careful tone of someone presenting a contingency they hoped was purely academic. Akoro had looked at the plan for a long time. Then he had said, "Run full simulation suite." "I want it ready." Yablonsky had said, "Yes, sir," and then, "Do you think we'll need it?" Akoro had said, "I think we should know what we have available." Now he stood at the tactical display watching 17 ships enter the Jovian cloud layer on a bearing he had run in simulation 43 times over 6 months, and the preparation met its purpose, and the cold clarity in the back of his mind sharpened from background awareness to foreground focus. "All ships," he said, "cloud insertion in 30 minutes, anchor teams to stations." The operation began at 1200 hours, Sol Standard. Third Fleet rendezvoused with the outer edge of the Jovian cloud layer, at a point mathematically equidistant from all 3 of the Council's observation platforms in the system. The knives went in first, running quiet, dropping below the cloud ceiling into the amber Andoker strata, where the pressure was high enough that the Council's probes would struggle with targeting resolution. The larger ships followed in a staggered formation that Yablonsky had designed to minimize their collective sensor return, spread across 50 kilometers of altitude differential, using the cloud density variations as natural baffling. Each ship in a position calculated to be in the coverage shadow of at least 2 others from the perspective of the Council's orbital platforms. It was very beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they represent the convergence of years of careful work into a single operational moment. The amber light of Jupiter filtered through the cloud layers in shifting horizontal bands, and the ships moved through it in near silence, running minimum emission protocols, navigating by the pressure flow maps that the research teams had spent years building. 2 of the knives found whales within the first 40 minutes. The creatures were where the models said they would be, great slow-moving masses in the middle stratosphere, drifting with the prevailing ammonia winds in the loose aggregations they formed during the equatorial pressure cycle. The knives locked anchors, careful, precise, the result of hundreds of simulated practice runs, and cut thrust and went silent. On any sensor array, they were just 2 more odd shapes moving through the Jovian deep, enormous and biological and of no strategic interest whatsoever. The third knife, designation GF7, call sign Javelin, drew a probe. It happened fast, the way bad things happen when you have prepared for everything except the specific bad thing that arrives. The probe came out of the cloud ceiling on an intercept vector, targeting solved, arming sequence active. A machine doing exactly what it was built to do, which was to destroy things that didn't belong. The pilot of Javelin, a 29-year-old warrant officer named Kessler who was from Lagos and had been flying combat vessels for 6 years, and who had run the Nantucket ride simulation 19 times in the past month, had about 3 seconds between detection and engagement. She did not hesitate. She fired her anchor into the nearest whale. The whale was 200 meters to Javelin's port side, drifting on the ammonia current, 3 kilometers of biology utterly indifferent to the small drama happening in its vicinity. The anchor punched into the creature's exterior membrane, not deeply, not enough to cause more than a minor irritation to something that massive, and then the tether snapped taut and Javelin swung hard, pivoting on the anchor line, and tucked itself against the whale's flank, in the specific position the simulation had identified as the maximum sensor shadow. The ship went to zero emission standby. Its heat signature dropped to ambient in 11 seconds. Its mass return, on any Council sensor array, merged with the whale's biological mass and became indistinguishable from it. A minor density variation in an already enormous biological object, the kind of reading that a targeting algorithm trained to identify manufactured objects would classify as biological noise and ignore. The probe's targeting solution collapsed. It had been tracking a fast-moving manufactured object on a suspicious bearing. Now it was tracking a biological mass moving at whale speed, and the object it had been targeting was simply gone, and the probe's discrimination algorithm ran its classification protocols and found nothing that met its engagement criteria, and the probe held fire. Kessler held her breath. The probe circled twice, running its sensor sweeps in the methodical pattern that Yablonsky's intelligence files had documented in detail. First sweep, wideband electromagnetic, nothing registering. Second sweep, thermal gradient mapping. The whale's biological heat output overwhelmed anything Javelin's residual systems were producing. Third sweep, mass displacement sonar, the probe's deepest and most sensitive sensor mode. The whale's 3-kilometer body returned a reading so massive that Javelin's 30-meter hull was lost in it entirely, the way a stone is lost on the floor of an ocean. The probe moved on. Kessler did not release her breath for another 11 seconds, until the probe's signal had dropped below her passive detection threshold. Then she let it out slowly, the way you let out something you've been holding for a very long time, and she sat in the amber dark with the whale's flank 3 meters outside her viewport. She could see the texture of it, the slow biological movement of its membrane as it processed the atmosphere. And she did the thing that humans do when fear finds no outlet and the body needs something to do with its energy. She hummed. It was very quiet and very steady, and it did not stop until the all-clear registered on her comms. The tune was old, older than spaceflight, a shanty from the age of Earth's sea whaling, something she had heard her mother play on a recording when she was small and had never quite lost. She didn't think about the words. She just held the melody, note by note, in the pressure and the amber dark and waited. In the comm log later, someone found the recording. It circulated briefly among the fleet's crews with the kind of quiet reverence that military communities develop for the specific small human moments that reveal what a person is made of. A warrant officer, alone in a ship pressed against the side of an alien creature in the clouds of Jupiter, humming to herself while a Council weapons platform circled looking for her. Not crying, not praying, not declaring anything to anyone. Just holding on and humming and waiting for the moment to pass so she could do the next thing. The rest of the fleet moved through the cloud layer over the next 9 hours, using the whale aggregations as cover, navigating the pressure bands, following the operational plan with the precision of something that had been rehearsed until it became instinct. The Council's observation platforms, reviewing their sensor data, saw a gradual increase in biological movement in the outer Jovian cloud layer, consistent with seasonal atmospheric pressure changes that had been logged and filed and ignored for the entire 12 years of Earth's petitions. Nothing unusual, nothing that required a report, nothing that triggered a flag. The reports that were required, the ones that would have flagged 17 military vessels moving in a systematic pattern through the Jovian cloud system, using the gas giant's own megafauna as mobile concealment, were never generated because the sensors were never given a reason to generate them. The Council's platforms were looking for ships. They were very good at finding ships. They had never once been asked to consider whether a ship might be pressed against the side of something else entirely, humming quietly in the dark. At 300 the following morning, the fleet emerged from the outer edge of the Jovian system on a clean vector toward Kepler Station. All 17 ships, no losses. The knives were at last out, Kessler's javelin pulling free of the whale with the care of someone removing a bracelet from a sleeping wrist. The anchor assembly retracted without drama, the creature never once acknowledging the presence of the small hard things that had ridden its side through the long dark hours. It drifted on in the ammonia current, vast and indifferent and magnificent, and Kessler watched it go on her rear camera feed for the few seconds before fleet acceleration pulled it below the horizon of her display. "Thank you," she said quietly, to no one in particular, and pushed the throttle up. The Council detected them at 3:11. At 3:12, Kepler Station's orbiter platforms went to engagement posture. At 3:13, Admiral Reyes Marchetti, speaking from Lunar Operations Center on a tight beam relay, transmitted the third and final message to the Galactic Council. It said, "Stand down your weapons. Return our people. This offer expires in 60 seconds. The Council took 58 of those seconds to respond. What happened in the Council chamber at Kepler Station in those 58 seconds was not, technically, a debate. The Galactic Council did not debate. It deliberated. It considered positions. It sought consensus. But what happened in those 58 seconds was as close to panic as a body composed of 7 distinct species, with 17 distinct neurological architectures, was capable of generating, because the Council had spent 12 years studying humanity and had built a model of human behavior based on 12 years of diplomatic petitions, cultural exchange programs, carefully worded protests, and measured formal grievances, and the model had not included this. The model had not included the possibility that humanity had spent those 12 years preparing for exactly this contingency, that the cultural exchanges had included xenolinguists learning Council languages they weren't supposed to know, that the research missions had been filed under biology and atmospheric science, while the actual operational data being gathered was on Council weapons platforms and their targeting algorithms, that the diplomatic patience had been real and genuine and had simply had a limit, and that when the limit was reached, it would be reached cleanly, without ambiguity, without posturing, without a warning that wasn't also a weapon. The Council's senior arbiter was a being of the V-Horith species, tall, multi-limbed, with the particular cold intelligence of a creature evolved in a pressure-variable deep ocean environment, someone who had sat on the Council for 60 of their species' standard years, and who had personally voted against humanity's petition all 5 times. The arbiter had studied humanity, had read the reports from the observer drones, had noted the 12 years of petitions with their careful language, their mastery of Council protocol, the gradual and patient way humanity had learned the rules of engagement and applied them with diligence, had concluded, as the model suggested, that humanity was an ambitious but fundamentally cautious species, operating on time horizons longer than their biological lifespan, because their civilization was structured for continuity, and that this caution made them ultimately manageable. The model had not accounted for what happened when a cautious species ran out of patience. The model had not accounted for the Jovian cloud layer. The model had not accounted for Warrant Officer Kessler humming quietly to herself against the flank of an airwheel, holding still in the dark, waiting for the probe to move on so she could do the next thing. The senior arbiter looked at the tactical display showing 17 human ships on a clean approach vector to Kepler Station and felt, for the first time in 60 years of service, genuinely uncertain. Not about the outcome of an engagement. The arbiter was not so undisciplined as to let outcome anxiety cloud tactical thinking. Uncertain about the model itself, about the foundational assumption that had underwritten every council decision regarding humanity for 12 years. About whether the thing they were looking at was actually what they had believed humanity to be, or whether it was something else entirely, something that had always been there and had simply been patient enough not to show itself until the moment it chose. The discovery of the severed position buoy, the emergency location transponder from the GCS deliberation, found drifting in the outer system by one of Okoro's advanced scouts 3 days earlier, and forwarded to council channels with a timestamp and a full technical analysis of its destruction, had been the first indication that the model might be wrong. The deliberation had not simply disappeared, it had been stopped. And the buoy, severed and drifting, was what happened when you stopped a ship carrying a diplomatic mission and you didn't want the evidence to tell a story you couldn't control. Someone had made a decision to end the deliberation's journey. Someone had made a decision to return the beacon in pieces. Someone had made a decision that humanity would accept this as a final answer. That someone had been wrong. In the 58 seconds of deliberation, the council did not reach consensus. What it reached was a temporary and fragile state in which a majority of its members recognized, simultaneously, that the tactical situation had characteristics they had not anticipated, and that the 60-second clock was running. The senior arbiter gave the order to hold fire on their own authority, overriding 2 objecting delegations, and transmitted to Admiral Reyes Marchetti the single word that existed in every council language as the universal signal for, "We are prepared to negotiate." It was the 59th second. The fleet held position at 60,000 kilometers from Kepler Station, not retreating, not advancing, holding in the particular way that a force holds when it has made its point and is waiting to see if the point has landed. Reyes Marchetti said to Okoro, over the secure command channel, "They blinked." Okoro said, "They did." Reyes Marchetti said, "Don't let anyone relax." Okoro said, "Nobody here is relaxed, Admiral." She almost smiled, not quite. The negotiation that followed took 9 days. The politics of it, the grievances filed, the precedents argued, the linguistic frameworks constructed to allow the council to concede what they had to concede while saving whatever face was available to be saved, were the work of diplomats and lawyers and xenolinguists, and that work, while essential, was not what the 9 days were actually about. What the 9 days were actually about was simple, and it was this. Humanity had demonstrated, in the space of 72 hours, that the council's model of them was wrong, and the council was trying to build a new model in real time while under the steady pressure of 17 warships that had come out of the Jovian cloud system, without losing a single vessel. The council's senior arbiter met privately with Reyes Marchetti on day 4. This was irregular. The council did not do private meetings with non-member delegations. The meeting was initiated by the arbiter and took place on neutral ground, a conference room aboard the GCS Neutrality, a ship specifically designated under the Accords for exactly this kind of meeting, which was the council's way of acknowledging that the Accords still technically applied without acknowledging anything else. The arbiter said, through a translator, "You concealed your ships using biological entities." Reyes Marchetti said, "We used what we knew." The arbiter was silent for a moment in the way V. Horace were silent when they were processing something that did not fit their existing categories. "We have records of your research missions, the atmospheric study programs, the biological monitoring protocols. We reviewed them and found nothing of military significance. Reyes Marchetti said, "You were looking at the data through the wrong lens." Explain. You were looking for weapons development, for military technology, for the kind of data a species collects when it is preparing to fight. She paused. We were not preparing to fight. We were preparing to survive. There is a difference. A species that is preparing to fight collects data on how to destroy things. A species that is preparing to survive collects data on everything, because when you are smaller and slower and you have less of everything, the only advantage you have is knowing more. Knowing more than you appear to know. Knowing things that your adversary has decided are not worth knowing. The arbiter processed this. The air whales. The air whales, Reyes Marchetti agreed. 20 years of research that your council classified as irrelevant and never reviewed again. We found them beautiful and worth studying. We also found them useful, eventually. The two things are not in conflict. A long silence. Outside the neutrality's viewport, the stars were fixed and distant, and Kepler station was a faint geometry of light 60,000 kilometers away, and between it and the station, invisible at this range, 17 human ships held their bearing. Your people, the arbiter said, the ambassador and her delegation. Yes, Reyes Marchetti said. My people. They are alive. The room was very quiet. Reyes Marchetti kept her face still by an act of will that cost her more than she would ever tell anyone. She said, I need verification of that. You will have it. Before this conversation continues. The arbiter gave the order from the table, right there, and within 20 minutes a medical report and a live feed image arrived on Reyes Marchetti's secured terminal. Ambassador Akaffer, sitting in what appeared to be a standard council detention facility, clean, adequate, nothing punitive, looking thinner than she should have been, and with the particular careful expression of someone who had been managing fear for a very long time. Beside her, all 9 of her staff, all alive, some with visible signs of the weeks in detention but none in any immediate medical danger. Akaffer looked directly at the camera with an expression that Reyes Marchetti had last seen on her face at the going-away dinner before she left for Proxima Station. That specific steady readiness, the diplomat's version of Kessler's quiet hum. As if she had known, somehow, that someone would come. As if she had simply been waiting, with the patience of someone who had spent her career betting on a particular and stubborn species, and the bet had paid out. Reyes Marchetti said to the arbiter, their release is the precondition for every other conversation. That is acceptable, the arbiter said. It was said simply, without visible reluctance, and that simplicity told Reyes Marchetti more than a longer response would have. The council had not expected humanity to come this far. They had expected the model to hold the cautious, ambitious, patient species, the posturing response, the quiet acceptance. Instead, they had gotten 17 ships coming out of the Jovian clouds, and a 60-second ultimatum, and an admiral who had not, at any point in the proceedings, raised her voice or made a single empty threat. Reyes Marchetti said, there are members of the council who will argue that our actions constitute aggression under the Accords. There are, the arbiter said. We destroyed nothing, we harmed no one. We moved our ships into a position that would allow us to act if the situation required it. The Accords define aggression as the unprovoked application of force. We have not applied force. We have demonstrated capability. Your arbiter platforms fired on our property and our people were disappeared. If any of this goes to arbitration, I am comfortable with how it reads. You are comfortable, the arbiter said, because you know it will not go to arbitration. I know that a body whose arbitration staff is comprised entirely of its own member species has a structural conflict of interest in any case where its own conduct is being reviewed. A pause. We have known that for 12 years. Silence. Then you have been playing a longer game than we understood. We have been playing the only game available to us, Reyes Marchetti said. For 12 years, that game was petitions and patience. You changed the game when you put our people in a cell and sent us back pieces of a diplomatic beacon. She looked at the arbiter steadily. We simply adjusted. The ambassador and her delegation were transferred to the GCS neutrality on day 6. Reyes Marchetti watched the transfer on the command feed and did not, in front of her staff, show what she felt, which was the specific and overwhelming relief of a person who has been operating on controlled cold anger for 6 days and has just received confirmation that the thing driving the anger has been resolved. She filed it away to feel later in private, where it could be felt properly. Okoro called her that evening from the Kerensky. He said, "They're aboard, they're okay. HFY sends her compliments." Reyes Marchetti said, "What were her exact words?" Okoro was quiet for a moment. She could hear something in the background, the sound of a crew that had been at combat readiness for 6 days finally, carefully, beginning to breathe. Voices. The specific register of soldiers who have done a hard thing and done it right and are now in the aftermath of that. Someone laughing, the kind of laugh that comes out of the end of a hard thing, the laugh that says we are still here. He said, she said, "I knew you'd come. I just had to make myself useful while I waited." Reyes Marchetti said, "That sounds right." In her detention, HFY had played Fizbin with her staff every day. An old confidence trick dressed up as a card game, invented as a distraction by a fictional starship captain in a century-old television program. No actual rules, just improvised complexity, the game changing every time someone tried to master it, the goal being to keep minds engaged rather than to win. She had used it to keep 11 human minds sharp and unified and functioning, not to manage anxiety but to maintain capacity, because she had decided early on that she would not simply wait, and that if she was going to be someone's pawn, she was going to be an actively inconvenient one. She had also, with more systematic purpose, spent her 3 weeks memorizing the layout of the detention facility, the rotation schedule of the staff, the sound patterns of the ventilation system, the precise dimensions of the observation windows, the diet and sleep cycles of all 9 of her people. She had prepared, in her head, a detailed structural assessment of the facility that she intended to use if a rescue did not come, because she had decided that she would not be a passive object in someone else's story, and that if the council had made a mistake in taking her, part of the cost of that mistake would be that she would make herself as difficult as possible to hold. The rescue had come, the assessment was never used. But the decision to make it, the refusal to be passive, the particular human insistence on remaining useful even in the most constrained circumstances, was the thing that had kept her staff intact and ready to walk out when the neutrality's airlock opened. On day 9, the council issued a statement. It said, "In recognition of the demonstrated interstellar presence, diplomatic persistence, and strategic capability of the species of the 3rd planet of the Sol system, the Galactic Council opens the matter of associate member status for full reconsideration. A new hearing will be scheduled at the earliest available session. This communication supersedes all previous final determinations on the matter." It did not apologize. The council did not apologize. The V-Horath language did not contain a direct equivalent of the concept, but the council's statement was, structurally, an apology. It used the formal framework of reconsideration, which in council high notation carried an implicit acknowledgement of prior error, which was the closest the language allowed. The xenolinguists had recognized it immediately, and had noted it in their analysis with the particular satisfaction of people who had spent 12 years learning a language well enough to hear what it wasn't saying. What the council did not understand was that humanity did not particularly need the apology. They had not come to Kepler Station for an apology. They had not come for associate member status, though that would have its uses. They had come because there was a line, and the line had been crossed, and humanity had a very old and very persistent habit of responding to that kind of crossing, not with rhetoric but with action. And the action had to be sufficient to make the point clearly enough that the point would not need to be made again. Reyes Marchetti took 3 days of leave after the fleet returned to inter-system stations. She was not a person who usually took leave. Her staff had been trying to make her take leave for 2 years. She spent the 3 days at her apartment in Tycho Station, sleeping more than she had slept in months, reading a novel that had nothing to do with anything she was professionally responsible for, eating food cooked by her own hands, and sitting, on the last evening, at the wide observation window that looked out over the lunar plains toward the distant blue-white spark of Earth. She thought about Ambassador Acaffer in the dark of a council detention facility, playing an impossible card game with her staff to keep their minds from closing in on themselves. The game changing every time someone tried to master it. The rules rebuilt fresh every session. The goal not to win but to stay sharp, stay together, stay ready. The oldest trick humans had: turn the wait into work, turn the fear into function, hold on until the moment arrives and then use it. She thought about Warrant Officer Kessler, pressed against the flank of an airwheel in the Jovian deep, humming something that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with being a person from a place, with a mother who played old music, with a specific and irreducible humanity that a probe's targeting algorithm had no framework for recognizing or accounting for. Not brave in the declarative sense. Just doing the next thing and the thing after that, and holding on between them. She thought about the 17 years ago when she had been a lieutenant commander on a deep-range patrol vessel, and had spent 8 months in the outer system with a crew of 61 people and very limited communication, and how in those 8 months she had learned something she had never quite forgotten. That the distance between human beings and everything else in the universe was not a weakness but a kind of strength, because it meant that humans carried everything they needed inside themselves and in each other, and that what they needed most was not equipment or resources, but the knowledge that someone was coming. That someone was always coming. That was the compact. The unwritten and unspoken compact that ran underneath all of the official structures, the petitions and the protocols and the command hierarchies and the accord frameworks. You go out there and do the hard thing and we will come for you. We will do whatever it takes. We will spend years preparing in secret. We will ride whales through the clouds of Jupiter in the dark. We will give them 60 seconds and mean it. We will come. She looked at Earth a little longer, then she went to bed. In the fleet's comm logs, filed under routine behavioral data, and never reviewed by anyone outside Lunar Operations Center, there was a 40-second audio clip from the interior recorder of Warrant Officer Kessler's ship, designation GF7, call sign Javelin, recorded during the 11 seconds when the probe circled and the targeting solution collapsed, and the decision that would shape the next decade of human-council relations hung in the pressure and the amber dark of Jupiter's clouds. Kessler was humming. The tune was eventually identified, 3 years later, by a junior archivist who happened to be a fan of very old Earth music. It was a sea shanty, centuries old, about whalers in the North Atlantic, about the moment the harpoon found its mark, and the whale took the line and the boat swung into the churning dark water, and the crew held on with everything they had, and the ocean tried to swallow them, and they refused to let it. The shanty's chorus was about the speed and the chaos and the water coming over the gunwale, and about the whalers who held the line and did not let go because they were stubborn, and because they had a job to do, and because letting go was not a thing they had come out here to do. It was called Nantucket Sleigh Ride. The archivist filed a note in the behavioral archive, cross-referenced it with the mission report, marked it with the standard tag for items of cultural historical interest, and then went to lunch. Outside the cafeteria window, the lunar plain stretched away in the long horizontal light, and somewhere overhead, 11 human beings who had spent 3 weeks in a council cell making themselves useful were home, and 17 ships were back at station. And in the diplomatic queue at Kepler Station, a new hearing was scheduled for humanity's petition, and in the Jovian clouds, far down in the amber strata, a pair of airwheels drifted through the ammonia, and the pressure carrying no passengers and no anchors and no memory whatsoever of the small hard things that had once clung to their sides and waited for their moment. That was fine. The whales didn't need to remember. Humans were very good at remembering for them. And somewhere in the middle of the Jovian pressure band, in the specific cloud layer where the thermal upwellings were strongest, and the kite creatures rode the columns high above the whale aggregations, and the amber light filtered down in shifting horizontal sheets, a single piece of metal tumbled slowly in the current, not a weapon, not a ship, not a probe. A small titanium bracket from Javelin's anchor assembly, shaken loose during the deployment in the chaos of probe detection and never recovered. It would drift there for a very long time, probably, longer than any human life, longer than any human institution, maybe. The Jovian currents did not give things back. But it had been there. A human thing, in a place no human thing should have been able to go, that had arrived because a 29-year-old pilot from Lagos had held on in the dark and trusted the plan and waited for the moment. It was a very small piece of metal. It was exactly what it needed to be. The Council's sociologists would spend years revising their model. Their initial post-incident analysis ran to 400 pages and contained, buried in the methodological appendix at page 312, an admission that no prior council study of a pre-member species had produced behavioral predictions that were wrong in this particular way. Previous modeling failures had been failures of scale, underestimating how quickly a species might develop a specific technology, or overestimating their resource extraction capacity, or miscalculating the timeline of their political consolidation. These were errors in degree. The error with humanity was an error in kind. The Council had looked at 12 years of patient, rule-following, petition-submitting behavior, and had concluded that patience and rule-following were what humanity was. They had not considered that patience and rule-following might be what humanity was doing, which was a different thing entirely, and that what humanity was existed underneath that, and was something the 12 years of petitions had never been designed to reveal. The revision process was uncomfortable. The V-Horath arbiter who had overseen humanity's petitions for all 12 years requested and received an assignment to a different portfolio. The Observer drone program was restructured, not to improve its coverage of Earth. The Council's analysts had concluded that improving coverage would not have helped, because the data they needed was not the kind of data you could observe from outside, but to include a new methodological requirement. Species assessment teams were required to spend physical time in the environment their subject species inhabited, not observing from a distance, but actually present in the atmospheric layers and orbital spaces and research stations, and deep-range patrol routes that shaped how the species understood and moved through their physical world. The requirement was controversial. The Council's assessment teams were not accustomed to field conditions. Several delegations objected on grounds of safety and on grounds that the methodology was imprecise and yielded qualitative data that was difficult to quantify and integrate into the standard modeling frameworks. The V-Horath delegation, in the one public statement their reassigned arbiter made before departing for their new assignment, noted that the methodology was imprecise and yielded qualitative data that was difficult to quantify, and that this might be precisely why it was necessary, because the things they had failed to understand about humanity were all precisely of the type that precise quantitative methods from a distance were structurally incapable of capturing. This statement was not adopted into official council policy, but it was noted, and it circulated, and in the years that followed, several of the council's more thoughtful member species analysts began spending time in human-occupied space in ways that were not strictly required by any protocol, and that generated data which did not fit cleanly into any existing analytical framework, and which was, nevertheless, somehow useful. One of them spent a month on Lunar Operations Center as a formal observer during an unrelated training exercise. Reyes Marchetti met with them twice, brief professional conversations, nothing substantive. But she noticed, in the second meeting, that the analyst had acquired a habit, in the 3 weeks since their arrival, of standing at the observation windows during off hours, looking out over the lunar plains toward Earth, in the specific posture of someone who has encountered something they do not yet have a framework for and is trying to find one. She did not mention it. She simply noted it, filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that were not yet useful but might be, and moved on. The Kepler station hearing was scheduled for 8 months after the incident. It was the 6th hearing, and it differed from the previous 5 in one specific respect. The council had, in preparation for it, assigned 3 of their most senior xenolinguists to review all 12 years of humanity's diplomatic correspondence, not for protocol compliance, but for what it revealed about human intent, human strategy, and the gap between what humanity was saying in high notation and what humanity was actually doing in the orbital spaces and cloud layers of its home system. The report those xenolinguists produced was, according to the one person on the council's staff who had the clearance to read it and the candor to discuss it informally, the most uncomfortable document in the council's archives. It documented, with forensic precision, all the things humanity had been doing in plain sight that the council had looked at and not seen. The operational data gathering, the language learning, the strategic patience, the preparation of contingencies that had been meticulously maintained for years while the petitions continued on the surface, and the observer drones filed their reports about cultural exchanges and atmospheric research. It documented the Fizbin games in the detention facility, which the analysts had initially classified as an anxiety management technique, and had now reclassified, after reviewing Akafar's full debriefing, as a command cohesion protocol, a method for maintaining group functionality under adversarial confinement, developed informally by a diplomat who had no military training and had simply understood, without anyone telling her, that what her people needed was not comfort but engagement. The document concluded, in the careful language of council analytical reports, that humanity's behavior over the 12-year petition period represented a level of strategic depth and patience that the council's pre-member species models did not currently have a category for, and that the absence of this category had led directly to the incident, and that the incident had resulted in a tactical and diplomatic situation that had cost the council more than any prior pre-member species assessment failure in their recorded history. It did not recommend denying the petition. The hearing lasted 2 days. Ambassador Akafar led humanity's delegation. She was thinner than she had been before the incident, and she walked with a slight stiffness that her doctor had told her would fade in time, and she wore her diplomatic credentials on a lanyard that was slightly different from the one she had worn before. The new one was a gift from Specialist Tours and Specialist Cho, made in the detention facility from materials they had quietly accumulated over 3 weeks. A piece of practical human ingenuity that Akafar wore not as a sentiment but as a reminder, because it was useful to carry reminders of what humans could make from very little when they had the time and the need. She presented humanity's case in high notation, in the formal register, with complete adherence to council protocol. She was, as she had always been, impeccably prepared, every precedent properly cited, every argument correctly structured within the council's deliberative framework, every cultural deference to the seniority hierarchy observed. She also, at one point in the second day, departed briefly from formal high notation to address the council in the V. Horath's own Deepwater Register, the language of private counsel, of peer-to-peer communication, of things said without diplomatic intermediation, and said, in that register, "We have tried to learn your rules well enough to use them. We hope you will extend us the same courtesy and learn ours." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then the senior arbiter's replacement, a younger V. Horace, who had been at Kepler Station during the incident and had watched the 17 ships on the tactical display, and had, in the privacy of their own processing, spent considerable time afterwards sitting with the uncertainty that the elder arbiter had refused to express publicly, said, in the same register, "We are learning." The petition was approved on the final day of the session. Associate member status, effective immediately, with a full review for full membership scheduled in 5 standard years. The vote was not unanimous. Nothing in the council was ever unanimous, and the species who had voted against did so loudly and on principled grounds that they were entitled to hold. But it was a clear majority, and it was final. And when the result was transmitted to Earth, it arrived at Lunar Operations Center at 6:44 hours, Sol Standard, which was early morning in the section of the building where Admiral Reyes Marchetti's office was located. She was already at her desk. She was always at her desk early. She read the result twice. Then she called Akoro, who was at his desk on the Kerensky because he was also always at his desk early, and she said, "It went through." Akoro said, "Good." A pause. Outside Reyes Marchetti's window, the lunar plains were in the long cold light of lunar morning, absolutely still and silver gray, and the blue-white spark of Earth was high and clear. She said, "You know this doesn't mean it's over." Akoro said, "I know. 5 years to full membership review. The 2 delegations that voted against us are not done. The model they've been building is still wrong in ways they don't know yet, and when they figure it out they'll have options we haven't prepared for." "I know," Akoro said again, "and then we've been here before." She understood what he meant. Not this specific situation, not the council, not the petitions, not Kepler Station, but the shape of it. The particular and recurring situation of a species that was smaller and slower and had less of everything, facing a structure that was larger and older and did not yet understand what it was dealing with, and choosing patience and preparation and the specific stubbornness of creatures who had learned, somewhere very deep in their evolutionary history, that holding on was sometimes the only thing that stood between now and the future. They had been here before. They would be here again. The difference was that this time they had arrived at the table. "Keep the drills running," Reyes Marchetti said. "Always," Akoro said. She set down the handset and looked at the transmission for a moment longer, at the formal high notation of the council's approval, and the translation beside it, and the date stamp and the specific institutional language that meant, in the end, a simple thing: you are in. Then she looked at the lunar plains and the Earth beyond them and thought about all the people who had filed petitions over 12 years, and who had done their work with precision and care, and who had kept the other archive too, the quiet one, and who had been patient for a very long time and had not given up, and had not accepted the final answer when it came, because some answers are wrong even when they come from the right address. And knowing the difference between a real final answer and a wrong one that is dressed up as final, that was a human skill, one of the oldest they had. The skill of looking at a closed door and deciding whether it was closed because the room was empty or closed because someone on the other side didn't want you to know what was in there. 12 years ago, humanity had looked at the door and decided to knock louder. 6 months ago, they had looked at the door and decided to come in a different way. Now the door was open. She got up, put on her jacket, and went to brief her staff. There was a great deal of work to do, and the work had changed, and that meant the preparation had to change too, and she was already thinking about what that meant and what it would require. Not because she was worried, because she was ready. Because she had always been ready for the next thing, which was the only thing you could actually be ready for, and readiness was not a destination you arrived at and stayed in. It was something you did, continuously, for as long as you were here. Outside on the lunar plains, the light was changing. Earth turned patient and blue, above the silver horizon.